Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the Association of Engaged Buddhists Thursday night Dharma talk and meditation. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on. I'm on the land of the Gadigal and Wungal of the Eora Nation, and I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So we're really fortunate tonight to have Thay here to speak with us. So I'm just going to read a little bit about Thay. So Thay's ordained name is Thich Truc Tong Phap. So apologies for my pronunciation. Addressed as Thay, he's a South Australian living in Gladstone, a small town in the southern Flinders Ranges. He's had a long and varied career in the human services. Fully ordained in um, Fully ordained in September 2005, he has worked as a university chaplain and offered contemplative care in the area of palliative care. Since 2007, he has trained in clinical pastoral education and has worked until April 2021 as a supervisor and educator of chaplains in training. Thay lives with his beloved dogs, Joey and Lucy. So over to you, Thay.
Thank you very much, Kynan. Tonight I'm not wearing very formal Buddhist robes because I'm down in my caravan because it's 6 degrees here and it's been raining all day. So I've decided to come down to the caravan and put the heater on and keep warm. So if you don't mind me doing that, you don't mind me wearing a maroon top and all of that stuff, we'll go ahead. From what I can see, everybody has been practicing meditation before. So is there anybody who's never practiced meditation before? Good. Then there's no need for me to give any direction or anything. We'll just sit. Just come to a place of sitting and your meditation practice that you would normally do, and we'll sit for 15 minutes. And as we can't get a bell to work on Zoom, I'll just introduce it and end it with the spoken word. So let's find a way to sit comfortably and bring our attention to whatever the object of our meditation is. So bring your attention back into the room. Take your time. No need to rush. If you need to stretch or massage yourself, please do so. In my training as a school teacher, about 1,000 years ago, it seems, but it was 1977, really. I was reading an educationalist, a Brazilian educationalist called Paulo Freire, who was teaching literacy to very poor people in Brazil, people who lived in the slums, in the favela. And they were people who were pretty sorely oppressed by the social situation and the economic situation there. And he wanted to teach them to learn to read in a way that would empower them politically and take much more pride in their cultural background. He wrote a book called of the Impact a lot. And what I'm really conscious of is that first he educated or learning into two types. One was what he called the banking method, where the teacher would pour information into the heads of the students and they would learn to regurgitate what they learned. And that's how they passed exams. And he saw that as being very disempowering. The method that he developed was a dialogical method, a method that was involved in dialogue and took the students' experience of life really seriously, that the students' experience of life became the subject matter. And the teacher, the so-called teacher, was also a learner in that situation, and would learn about the reality of their students. And they would encourage the students and help the students to systematize their experience, so that they could see their poverty and their powerlessness as something that was the result of a social system and not just their own problem, their own fault. And he used that. He developed a method of teaching reading literacy, using that approach. And one of the things that's bothered me for a long time about giving Dharma talks is that more often than not, I use and other Buddhists use the process of the banking method. We come up with a topic. You don't get invited to know what that topic is going to be until you get there. Then we give a talk. We put all this stuff in your head. And then quite often teachers will say, are there any questions? Which is to say, there's no discussion. There's just questions about, whether you've understood what I said. And I think that that's not a transformative way to engage with the Dharma and to engage with one another as a Sangha. I would much rather develop a process of sharing the Dharma in the way that Paulo Freire talked about it in his work. And so tonight I'm going to launch out in my attempts to change my methodology of teaching, or my methodology of learning and teaching, and invite you into a more of a dialogue than me just ranting on at you about my particular perspective on the Dharma. One of the things that Paulo Freire was very interested in was what the teacher would learn from the students, so that the students would also become the teachers and the teacher would also become the students. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that I really appreciate that possibility in this group, because we always have a time for sharing at the end. And I've learned a great deal from other people's experiences. I've been encouraged by other people's experiences. So in my experience of this particular Sangha, the AEB, I'm also learning. I'm also a student, your student, and learning from what your experience is, your perspective is. So I'm part of the way there to achieving my ideal of being a Frarian-based Dharma teacher. But tonight we're going to push it a little bit further and see what happens. So if it doesn't work, I apologize in advance, but I hope it will work. What I'm going to ask is in a minute for Kynan to put on the share screen a poem that I introduced you to the last time, which was a poem that I wrote when I was in the monastery in the United States. And what I'm inviting you to do is to read that poem together and to answer some questions that will come up under the chat. So we're going to divide you into, I think, let's see how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 3 groups of 3, which is pretty perfect, and put you into, I don't know how many people have had this experience on Zoom before, but you'll go into, is it called a breakout room, kind? Yeah, you'll go into a breakout room, and with the 3 of you that's there, you can answer the questions that are posed about the poem. So what you need to do is read the poem together first and then answer the question, but make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to bring their perspective to the poem, and the questions that to be answered, or the questions to be responded to, are in the chat. Perhaps if I just read the poem, and it's called Staying in the Bamboo Forest. A cool silver moon hangs in a velvet black sky. She shows the way to myriad creatures of the night. Storm clouds gather, her face is shrouded, the light is no more. I sit and watch the parting of the clouds. So you are invited to go into your room together and to read the 2 new messages.
Hey, back to you, Thay.
Thank you very much, Kynan. So what we're going to do now is for people just to share one thing that came out of their conversation. And if you've got more to share, well, 2 things. But to share it as you will. And please don't be shy. What came up for you in that discussion, that conversation?
Right. What struck me was how our perspectives differed quite considerably from it, how it impacts our life, to just being in nature, to putting it in the context of Buddhism. Quite varied in our responses, which for me just helps, when you listen, helps you to open your mind and add to your understanding.
Right. Do you see that as helpful or positive?
Oh, definitely positive. Definitely.
Somebody else? Did you want to say something, Alan?
I got caught with the storm clouds gathering and realizing that I hadn't been watching close enough for the storm clouds to gather. I was not watching the moon, as it were. And then the clouds had gathered and the light was no more. But as I shared with the group, the end of the poem, I learned to sit and watch, and I see the parting of the clouds, and that lifts my spirit. So it was more of a personal response. But someone said it was philosophical.
Well, you do have that tendency in your personality.
I'll go away.
I didn't say that was a bad thing. I think we share it. Anyone else?
Yeah, finally. Yeah, okay. Well, say congratulations. It's close to being a perfect poem. Very well written. Really, not even one word extra on it. Only down to the moment. I really loved it. Fantastic.
And what did it tell you? I don't mean, what am I saying? I'm saying, what did it tell you?
It tells me the myriad creatures, that we all have the Buddha nature. The moon, the light comes down on all of us, little or large beings. I don't know if you had this in mind. May I ask that? What you had in mind?
You can, but I won't answer it yet, because I'm more interested in what you think than what I think.
Well, I think you had in mind enlightenment, that we have the Buddha nature. We share the moonlight. It's really very well said. One thing I didn't quite understand is, as Alan said, the storm clouds. Is it our faults, mistakes, shortcomings, what we have to correct and work on? That was the feeling I had from it. But the last two sentences took me back to Vad Buddha Dhamma 40 years ago, when I had beautiful 10 days in the monastery with Ayakema and Prakantipalo. Yeah, we react differently, every one of us. If you write down all the reactions, it will be all different, I'm sure of that, because we are all different, and yet we are part of the myriads of creatures who can share in the moonlight, and that is enlightenment. You see, we read into poems what is inside us. Maybe the poet never even dreamt about what I read from the poem. Because my whole life behind me, 80 years now, dictates what I have in the heart and in the mind, in the experience of life. So I might be wrong, but I enjoyed it, I loved it, and it's an excellent, nearly perfectly written poem.
Anybody else? Sorry.
Hi, Thay, this is Sue. It's interesting. I in our group break out. It's like everybody reads the same poem and comes up with a different interpretation of what it says. To me, the storm cloud gathers kind of stands out. It's sort of like the hindrances, like when you're meditating, you're quiet, then it comes and it disturbs you, and then so it's like you think you're quiet and then you're not anymore. So that's the thing that stood out most for me.
Hi, this is Leo. Sorry, I couldn't open my camera. Camera at the moment have problem. And from my point of view, how I understanding this poetry, it's just like a nature of the mind, and sometimes grabbing things, craving things, sometimes just see the things very clear. Then like when you first the sentence, when you sit down for first like meditating, then you mind clear, so you can see the sky, then can see the things very clear. Then sometimes, then after a while, then you mind grab things, attach things, have many attachment, like cloud. Then block your mind. In this time, so you couldn't see the light before very clear. Then this is the nature of the mind. Then you sit down there. Then this moment will pass, then clear again. So I think this poetry haven't ended. Then ended when I sit down there watching the clouding apart living. Then my mind clear again. Then I see the moon and the share the light, so you can see the way. So this is my way of understanding. Sorry about it.
Thank you, Lil. Anything else before we go on? You want to share something, Bill, or you're happy to not? That's up to you.
Yeah, I took things a bit more literal. And so I was so happy to hear Frank and Lil's versions. They read it much better than I did. So yeah, I was lucky to be in their little group. Yeah.
So how did you read it, Bill?
Oh, as I say, just a bit literally, I was just looking at the nature of it. I totally missed like the Buddha being the moon representing the Buddha, showing the light, the way to enlightenment and things like that. Only after hearing all these other interpretations, I realise I have a lot to learn about poetry.
When it comes to, I can't remember who said it. I think it was Suli said that, talked about different interpretations of something. And it brought to mind an experience of mine when I was teaching in Zimbabwe, and I was teaching in a school out in the countryside. So all the students were Africans, and their teacher was me. And I had to teach them for the Zimbabwe at that time, and I'm not sure about now, but at that time it used the Cambridge O-level system of education, which was from Britain, of course, because it had been a British colony. And I had to teach Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, which I found really a bit of a struggle why would rural African young people want to read Thomas Hardy? There's plenty of good African writers they could have been reading, but that's what Cambridge University insisted on, so that's what we did. And what was really interesting is that in the book, there's a character called Sergeant Troy, and he's a bit of a reprobate, really. He's a bit of a rat bag, and he impregnates a young woman called Fanny, and she dies. And then when she's died, Sergeant Troy's life falls apart. And what was really interesting was that one of my students said that what had happened was that the spirit of Fanny was really angry at Sergeant Troy, and so she came back into this life and destroyed his life for him, which is a completely different view from my own psychological kind of analysis of it, and probably very different from Thomas Hardy's pre-Freudian kind of interpretation of it. So a little line came up in the cartoon show Bluey the other night, where Dad says to Bingo that you can produce something really beautiful, but once you give it to the world, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the people who have interpreted it. And I thought that's such a lovely message coming from that fabulous cartoon show. And it's true that once somebody writes something or paints something or makes music, it doesn't belong to them anymore. They can have their interpretation, but once you release it to the world, it becomes the world's property, and people interpret things very differently. And I think that's just plain true, at least from my experience. Well, thank you for your responses. What I'll do now is just say a few things, not very long, but say a few things about my own experience of the poem. And I need to say that it's called Staying in the Bamboo Forest, and bamboo forest is the English equivalent to Truc, which is the name of my lineage. So staying in the bamboo forest is a reference to me staying in my own lineage and staying in the monastery and experiencing what that life as a trainee monk brought to me. And I also need to say that at the time I was the only European in my order, and so therefore the only European in the monastery. But not only was I the only European, I was the only Australian. So some people thought they might have to teach me English because after all I'm an Australian and not an American. So I had to remind them that in fact my ancestors invented the English language, and I wouldn't, and if they don't teach me English, I won't try and teach them Vietnamese. So it was a very interesting experience to be the only European, and the only European in the whole of the tradition at that time. I think there's been a Frenchman come along since, and there have been a couple of Americans who came but didn't stay, or came and I think one even died. Anyway, this poem formed in my mind over the first months of practice in my monastery in California. And it describes, from my point of view, the approach to meditation taken in my Zen tradition. I noticed throughout my journals over the coming years, and I kept a journal the whole time I was in the monastery and then subsequently coming home to Adelaide, I kept writing the journal. I noticed throughout my journals over the coming year and in subsequent years that I made a regular reference to this poem as I was reflecting on my life and my practice. Indeed, I've said the poem out loud on occasions as an opening verse when I sit down for meditation. So I sit for meditation and I read this poem out loud to focus my attention, focus my mind. So what is the history behind this poem? The founder of Shasta Abbey, which is a beautiful Soto Zen monastery in Northern California, was a woman called Roshi Jiu Kennett. She was an English woman, and she was contemporary with another English woman whom you may have heard of called Tenzin Palmo. And she had a very challenging time during her training in a Soto Zen monastery in Japan. Recently, I read her journal from that time for the second time and found so much for myself to identify with in regard to my time in a Vietnamese monastery. But I also found much good instruction from her on how to deal with challenging circumstances and the subsequent feelings and thoughts that arose within me. In my tradition, there are three practices that are most significant: sitting meditation, and in the monastery you sit for 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. Then we have a ceremony called, or a liturgy called Beginning Anew, which is a form of repentance, really. And we practice mindfulness in all we do, which is to say that we're present to everything we do without grasping onto anything that we want or entertaining any aversion to anything we don't want. Also, we're expected to cultivate what are called the 6 harmonies in our Sangha life, one of which is verbal unity, which means that we only ever exercise loving speech and we refrain from criticizing other monastics so that we don't contribute to any discord in the Sangha. That's perhaps one of the more challenging things. Putting together a reasonably large group of people who are very different from each other and not bound by family ties to live, work, meditate, study, and recreate with very little time to be apart creates a hotbed of struggle. There's nowhere more challenging to be and more terrifying sometimes than in a monastery. In my case, I didn't speak the language that others had in common, and I didn't share even basic cultural assumptions. Further, I was far from home. Everything that was familiar to me and all the people I loved, including my 2 beautiful little dogs at the time, I missed badly. And one of the people I missed was my beloved mother, who was coming towards the end of her life. I was always terrified that she would die and I wouldn't be there. So my life in the monastery I found to be extremely challenging. I have since then reread my journals from when I was in the monastery. And in the rereading of my journals, I saw many parallels with Reverend Master Jiu Kennett's experience. While my time in the monastery was extremely challenging, I found I had also recorded much that was good, including the humor that monks share. You might not know, but sometimes monks fall about in gale, and probably nuns too, fall about in gales of laughter because of something somebody says or does. And I discovered also, when I reread my journals, that a lot of the monks had a lot of respect for my effort, the effort I put into my monastic life, and the courage that it took to come all the way from Australia to America and into a Vietnamese context to practice. There was a monk who was very, very generously said that he thought I was very courageous. And there was a lot of kindness offered to me. There was one old monk who always reminded me of a Vietnamese hobbit, and he made me a brand new set of robes, and he was always really loving. He couldn't speak English, but every so often he'd bring me a bag of cream biscuits and things like that. So there was a real kindness there. And the other thing was that the 2 abbots that I lived with, Thay Thue Yak and Thay Thue Man, they were very, very kind to me. They were really supportive and loving towards me. And then I also remembered that my teacher in Vietnam took an interest in my life. One day, one of the monks came to me and said, "Oh, we've just been speaking to our teacher, and he's asked how you are going teaching the Americans." So while I was in the monastery, I didn't have any sense of that that kindness and that care for me there. but I had recorded moments of it in the diary, in my journal. And so when I reread my journal, I realized that there was much more positive going on there than I had remembered. I had forgotten the good stuff. And then I wanted to share one really lovely interaction with you from my time in the monastery. One day, the young monks, and I was one of the older monks, had written up on the board in chalk, "To be or not to be, that is the question," which of course is a quote from Shakespeare. And it was very amusing for them when they wrote it up. Oh, I've got a dog knocking on the door. Excuse me just for a moment. Come on. So they had written up on the blackboard, "To be or not to be, that is the question." And they found it very amusing. So I took up the blackboard rubber and I rubbed out the two "to be's" and replaced them with two Vietnamese words. "To be" became "Thơ Bi," and "Thơ Bi" in Vietnamese means loving kindness and compassion. So it then read, "Loving kindness and compassion, to be or not to be. Loving kindness and compassion, or not loving kindness or compassion? That's the question." And there was a lot of laughter ensued, and I realized I'd made a joke in Vietnamese, which I thought wasn't too bad for a little boy from Port Adelaide to be able to make a joke in this language he didn't even speak. So there was this, there were the many lovely moments I remembered when I reread my journal. And while I spent only just over a year in the monastery and have subsequently often felt my training to be inadequate, one American monk kept encouraging me to stay until I was ordained a bhikkhu and to see all the challenges as my training. Subsequently, I've understood everything that I've set out to do over the last 18.5 years by way of chaplaincy, sangha building, study, teaching, and just living a vowed life, most often alone, as my training too. Your training doesn't stop when you leave the monastery. The training goes on and on and on throughout your life. And I suppose Bhante Tejadhamma would attest to that too, as he doesn't live in a monastery anymore. But I'm sure his training continues even now, particularly as he faces all the physical problems that he faces. At the same time, things were very often challenging in the monastery, as I've said. One monk, and I'll call him Thay Didi, was an older man who during the war in Vietnam was in charge of the officers' mess in the place he was stationed. When he eventually went to the USA as a refugee, he set up his own restaurant in Boston. So in these two situations, he acquired all of the very bossy habits associated with being in charge of a mess and a restaurant. If you've ever worked with anyone who's in charge of a restaurant or anything, you'll discover that they can be quite bossy. And he was put in charge, Thay Didi was put in charge of the cooking in the monastery. And every monk was expected to assist him at least once a week, if not more often. And that included the Australian monk. At first, we got on well, he and I, and he shared much of his life with me. However, things soon changed, and he would become very impatient with me, including with the way I did the dishes. Eventually, I found Thay Didi too difficult to work with. So I asked another monk, Thay DM, who was in charge of the work rosters, if he would not put me on the same roster as Thay Didi. Thay DM laughed as he told me that I was not the only one who had made that request. So had a couple of other monks, and they were Vietnamese monks. So it wasn't just because I was an Australian, it was that some of the Vietnamese found him really difficult too. So Thay Didi was also the senior novice, and his habitual bossiness impacted on the rest of us novices. At the beginning of breakfast and lunch, he would walk up and down our table, rearranging everything according to his own ideas of how things ought to be done. And that drove me mad. And then Thay Didi had to go home to Boston as he had a heart condition and his family convinced him to come home so that they could look after him. Blessed relief, I thought. I never have to see this man again. I felt no concern for his health. I just felt concern for my own comfort. 6 months went by and it was time for our bhikkhu ordination. 6 months of ongoing challenge, loneliness and struggle to stay in there and learn what I might learn about myself and hope for some transformation within myself. Thay returned to the monastery as we, with numerous others, were to be made bhikkhus together. You can't imagine, actually, and neither could I have at the time, the delightful surprise I felt meeting up again with Thay. We were so pleased to be together again. All the irritation I had felt with him had disappeared completely and never returned. We sat with each other, our foreheads resting on each other and talking to one another. And it was really interesting because quite often when you get images of medieval Western monks, Christian monks, they quite often sit with their heads touching while they talk. And so this Vietnamese monk and I did the same thing. We just sat there talking together. And I asked myself the question, what had happened to transform this hostility and this irritation within me? I realized it was 6 months of sitting and watching the parting of the clouds. All the irritation was the clouds coming in to cover the light of the moon in the sky that would otherwise give myriad creatures of the night direction and knowing which way to go. But suddenly, after 6 months of constant practice within the monastery, and particularly in meditation, all the irritation I'd felt with him disappeared completely and it never returned. I realized it was 6 months of sitting and watching the parting of the clouds that had made the difference. So whenever I've subsequently been asked whether meditation works, I unhesitatingly say yes and tell the story of the miracle of Thay and Thay Thong Phap, a miracle that came only from staying in the bamboo forest. If I had run away from that situation, I would never have learnt what I learned, and I would never have experienced the real affection that I felt underneath it all for the other monk. And I would never have experienced an end to the hostility that I also felt. And I think that's what the poem is about for me. So, is there anything anybody wants to say about what I've mentioned, what I've talked about?
Just one short question, Thay. Could it be that we read into the poem, into the lines and the words, what we have inside us, or we want these words mean what's in us? Meaning, the words should mean what is within us. Not the real poem, but we read ourselves. Sometimes I have the feeling.
Well, I would like to be able to answer your question with another question to get you to think about it deeply, but I can't think of another question right now. But what I would say is that what I said before and what Sue Lee suggested is that once you write a poem and you give it to someone, it becomes a foil for them. Anything can be a foil in which you can see your own mind, you can see your own experience. So whatever was my experience, was my experience. Your interpretation or your response to my experience has to be yours. It can't be. So what it is actually doing is showing you something of yourself. That's the same in relationships. When we have a relationship with someone, like with Thay, what I came out of that relationship with was really a sense of who I was in it, not who he was. He was just being himself. And my irritation belonged to me. That was my stuff, not him at all. I think I'm answering your question. Am I?
Yes, you did.
That's the thing that's the thing about, I mean, the other thing is that I think it's really important to, once you get involved in a relationship, this could happen in a marriage or in a friendship or, you know, any kind of situation. If you're prepared to stay with that situation long enough, you will learn a great deal about yourself, because you will constantly see your own reflection in the relationship. You'll constantly see more about who you are, not so much necessarily about who the other person is, but who you are and what you have brought to that relationship, the load of rocks that you've carried on your back into the relationship. And if you don't stay, if you run away, if the relationship gets too difficult and you run away from it, or that monastery is not giving you what you thought you wanted, then you won't learn the lessons from staying. It's a very important thing to stay put sometimes. I mean, if the situation is really abusive, that's a different question. But if it's just challenging, then if you run away from it, you're likely to not learn the lessons that are available to you in that situation. And that's why I call it staying in the bamboo forest. There's been many, many challenges over the last nearly 20 years of being a monk in my tradition. And one of them is that I don't actually meet up with other monks in my tradition very much, or other nuns in my tradition very much. That's sometimes a challenge. But there's so much that I learn from being in it that I'm not willing to throw it away. I'm not willing to run away from it and try and find the perfect situation, try and find the perfect congregation, try and find the perfect teacher, of that sort of thing. Because I don't think that would ever happen, because there will always be challenges, because I carry around in me so much junk, and that will always show up until that great day when there's no junk left. But it's a long way off for me. It may not be so far off for the rest of you, but it's a long way off for me. So I think you're right, actually, Frank, that what you see in the poem is your own mind and your own experience. And that's as it should be.
Thank you, Thay. Thank you. You're doing very well, Thay. I have a feeling when you give the Dhamma talk that we are sitting on a 10-day course and you're sitting next to me. You're not above, not higher than I am, but sharing my struggles and the sincerity and talking about the feelings and the heart. Yeah, it's fun. Thanks very much. You're doing very well. And just keep it up for many, many years.
Hopefully many, many years. Yes. I think that's a really important thing to say about Sangha as well, is that a Sangha is a place where people can sit together and sit equally and share so much of what's gone on in their life and how they've reflected on it. That's one of the really important things that comes out of the treasure of the Sangha, the third ratana, the third jewel.
Yes.
Is that capacity to sit together and share. And interestingly enough, today I've come across three women recently living in this area. One woman lives in a town called Wilmington, and then another lives in a town called Bullaroo Centre, and then another woman lives in another town called Mambray Creek, which is just the other side of the Augusta Highway. And they're all Buddhists. And we hadn't discovered that until very recently. So today we came together in my house for meditation in the morning. And then afterwards we shared 2 questions. How did I come to the Dharma and what keeps me there? And it was a really, really lovely sharing. And we meditated for half an hour, and then we had this time of sharing, and then we had lunch together. And 2 of the women have texted me tonight to thank me for organising it. But what was really special was that capacity to share our lived experience and you know, our lived experience of how we came to the Buddha's teaching, and what is it that keeps us here? What is it that means we don't rush off and try something else, and you know. And that could be applied, because I live with a person who is a Christian priest and a religious sister, and I thought, well, that same question could be asked of anybody. You could ask of a Christian person, what drew you to the Christian faith and what keeps you there? And that would be just as fruitful as asking a Buddhist or a Muslim or whoever. So the capacity to share those deeper questions is a lovely thing, and a thing that helps build community.
I think we should finish there. That seems like a good spot. Is that okay, Tay?
That's fine. Shall we just dedicate the merit?
Please.
May the wholesome energy that we have generated here tonight and at any other time be for the benefit of all living beings. May all living beings be well and happy. May all living beings be free from suffering. May all living beings know peace and joy and the causes of peace and joy. And may we continue to walk the Buddha's path of truth and love together. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu.
Okay, see you next month.
Thank you, Thay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly say that Engaged Buddhists are run by completely volunteer run. And so if you'd like to support what we do and also support Tay, please consider donating or joining as a member. And also we have talks every Thursday, pretty much every Thursday. And also we have weekends of practice at Vajasala coming up this weekend and the last weekend in June. So consider joining one of those events as well. Thank you very much for being here. Great to spend the time with you, and have a great night.
Thank you, Kynan.
Take care.
Thank you.